Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're stepping directly onto the battlefield of the most monumental three-day tactical duel in American history. We are going to look at the Battle of Gettysburg, but not just as a dusty timeline of events. No, we're looking at it as a high-stakes, life-or-death chess match between two deeply contrasting generals. This is really a story about geography, desperate split-second decision-making, and how two totally different leadership styles, under unimaginable pressure, quite literally determine the fate of a fractured nation.
But before we even touch the tactics, we have to grasp the sheer human cost. 51,000. Over just 3 incredibly humid days in July 1863, roughly 51,000 men were killed, wounded, captured, or went missing. To put that into perspective, it's a staggering, almost incomprehensible number that stands to this very day as the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. It completely shocked both the Union and the Confederacy, and it absolutely changed the trajectory of the Civil War forever.
So you might be wondering, how did this all happen? The crazy part is, neither commander actually chose Gettysburg as their battlefield. It was, for all intents and purposes, an accidental collision. You had 75,000 Confederate troops and 93,000 Union troops just kind of maneuvering blindly toward each other. The Confederates were actually operating without their cavalry commander, J.E.B. Stuart, which essentially left them blind. They ended up colliding at Gettysburg simply because it was this massive hub where 10 different roads converge. They were basically drawn together like magnets.
Okay, let's dive into this. Number 1. The Clash of Commanders. The entire battle was shaped by opposing mentalities. On one side, you've got General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy. Lee was notoriously aggressive. He was offensive-minded. He knew the South couldn't win a long, dragged-out war of attrition. He desperately needed a decisive, crushing victory on northern soil to threaten cities like Philadelphia or Washington and maybe force a peace settlement. Now, on the other side is Union General George G. Meade. Get this, Meade had been put in command of the Army of the Potomac just 3 days before the battle. 3 days. Talk about pressure. He adopted a much more cautious, defensive mindset, relying on geographic advantages to repel Lee's aggressive thrusts.
Moving right along to Section 2, Day 1, the high ground.
July 1st, 1863 is where the physical terrain of this small Pennsylvania town begins to dictate the brutal rules of engagement. The day kicks off with Union cavalry under John Buford staging this brilliant delaying action against advancing Confederates. Buford bought just enough time for Union infantry under General John Reynolds to arrive, though tragically Reynolds was killed almost immediately. Throughout the afternoon, the fighting was just savage. Despite fierce resistance from units like the Iron Brigade, the Union line eventually collapsed under relentless Confederate pressure. The Union forces ended up routing in absolute chaos through the alleys and streets of Gettysburg, retreating south to a series of hills just outside the town.
And this brilliantly illustrates the geographic masterstroke of the battle. By retreating, the Union Army inadvertently stumbled into a natural defensive masterpiece. It's a fishhook-shaped ridge. If you look at the structure, you have Cemetery Hill at the bend of the hook, Culp's Hill at the barb, the long shank of Cemetery Ridge running south, and it's all anchored by Little Round Top and Big Round Top at the very bottom. Now, this fishhook formation gave Meade an incredible tactical advantage known as interior lines. What does that mean? Well, because Meade's army was curled inward, he could move troops and reinforcements really quickly from one threatened point to another across the short inner arc of the hook. It's like having a shortcut. Lee's forces, on the other hand, were wrapped all the way around the outside. To shift his troops, the Confederates had to endure exhausting marches along much longer exterior paths. Simply put, Meade held the center, and Lee had to run around the entire perimeter.
Which brings us to Section 3, Day 2, Little Round Top.
Having established that fishhook, Meade's interior defense was about to be severely tested by Lee's aggressive exterior attacks. Lee's plan was to hit both ends of the Union fishhook at the exact same time. He orders General Longstreet to assault the Union left and General Ewell to hit the right. But the coordination completely falls apart. Longstreet is delayed, and he doesn't attack until 4 p.m., which gives Meade critical hours to prepare. But then, Union General Daniel Sickles makes this unbelievable, frankly insubordinate blunder. Sickles marches his troops half a mile forward into a peach orchard. This creates an exposed bulge in the line and leaves the rocky hill of Little Round Top completely undefended right as Longstreet's brutal assault begins.
With Sickles' men getting absolutely slaughtered in the peach orchard and the wheat field, Union commanders are scrambling to plug this massive gap at Little Round Top. If the Confederates take this hill, it's game over. They could fire their artillery directly down the entire length of the Union line. The defense fell to the 20th Maine Infantry. They were positioned at the absolute extreme left edge of Meade's entire defensive line, the end of the line. And after repulsing wave after bloody wave of Confederate assaults, the Maine soldiers faced a terrifying reality. They were completely out of ammunition.
Command of the 20th Maine belonged to Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And get this, until recently, he'd been a college rhetoric professor. He had no formal military training. Facing overwhelming odds and holding empty rifles, Chamberlain doesn't retreat. Instead, he orders a visceral, desperate maneuver. He yells to fix bayonets, and they charge directly down the rocky, wooded slope right into the faces of the exhausted Confederate attackers.
It was an act of sheer, terrifying audacity, and it worked. The shock of the charge completely broke the Confederates' assault on that flank. Little Round Top held. Chamberlain's reckless brilliance saved the Union's left flank from total collapse, and in doing so, he validated Meade's overall defensive strategy, ensuring the fishhook remained intact for another night.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 4. Day 3, the center.
So Lee has tried the left. He has tried the right. Both failed. So on July 3rd, he makes a final, desperate offensive gamble. Lee reasoned that if Meade had rushed men to reinforce his flanks, well, the center of the Union line must be weak. To soften up that center, Lee unleashes the greatest artillery bombardment ever seen on the North American continent. 170 Confederate guns opening fire simultaneously. The noise was so deafening, it was reportedly heard all the way in Pittsburgh. But because of the thick smoke and chaos, the Confederate gunners fired too high. The massive bombardment was terrifying, for sure, but it was largely ineffective, exploding harmlessly behind the Union infantry, who were just hugging the dirt.
Believing the Union center was devastated, Lee ordered the infantry forward. Roughly 12,500 Confederate soldiers, under the command of Longstreet and General George Pickett, step out of the tree line. Now picture this. They had to march 3/4 of a mile across completely open fields in parade ground formation directly toward the center of Cemetery Ridge. General Longstreet had literally warned Lee it was a suicide mission, but Lee insisted.
Number 5. The high water mark.
What followed was one of the most dramatic and terrible collisions in military history. As the Confederates crossed that open field in what we now call Pickett's Charge, they were just slaughtered by Union artillery and musket fire. Miraculously, a small group, about 300 men led by General Lewis Armistead, actually breached the low stone wall at a spot called the Angle. This incredibly brief penetration is known today as the high water mark of the Confederacy. But it only lasted minutes. Why? Because Meade was utilizing those interior lines we discussed earlier. He was able to instantly pour Union reinforcements from all sides right into the center, sealing the breach and totally crushing the Confederate breakthrough. The survivors retreated. The battle was over. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the grim reality of these tactical choices becomes devastatingly clear when we break down the casualties. Over half of the 12,500 men who made Pickett's charge were killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of hours. Lee's aggressive, relentless offensive strategy basically shattered his army. He never launched another strategic invasion of the North again. Meade's defensive reliance on the high ground and interior lines won the day, absolutely, but at a devastating, heartbreaking cost to his own forces.
4 months later, President Abraham Lincoln traveled to this blood-soaked ground to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen. In just 272 words, the Gettysburg Address reframed the entire meaning of the Civil War. It was no longer just about preserving a union, it was about a new birth of freedom. But looking back at the staggering human sacrifice, the thousands of lives lost in a tactical duel of interior and exterior lines, it leaves us with a provocative question. Can a democratic government truly survive when its preservation requires such an unfathomable and catastrophic shedding of its own people's blood? Thank you for joining me on this explainer. I hope this helped illuminate the incredibly complex command duel at Gettysburg.